coming to celebrate this amazing guy named Jim Nisbet. My name is Patrick Marks, and I have a little bookstore across the street called the Green Arcade. And, well, thank you. I was lucky enough to work with Jim on 2 books, Snitch World, and one that had been in a drawer for a really long time called A Moment of Doubt. It was such an amazing pleasure, and what an editing genius, and he taught me so many things. Okay. So we're going to do a little bit of reading from his fabulous works. And I also want to thank Robin Azevedo. Robin, are you around? Robin, there she is. Hello, Robin Azevedo. Robin McCroskey Azevedo. Her grandfather built this building in 1925. And she was, shepherding the business for quite a long time, and has been so gracious to host tonight as well. So we've had some amazing events here, including Jim has read here a couple times. So without further ado, we're going to have a little bit of readings, and then we will have some personal statements about this fabulous guy. So I'd like to introduce to you Julie Lindo, who is going to read, I think she's going to read from Dark Companion. And I'm going to try to get this set up right, which I should have done before. And there we are. If you want to use this, you can, or...
Thank you. Thank you. How's that? A little closer? How's that? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Do I need to be louder? Is that good? Okay. I'm the guinea pig, so you let us know. Okay, I'm going to try not to cry. I might. Thank you. I wish I'd been able to read Jim Nisbet's books. When I was working on my degree in English literature, I would have written scores and scores of papers. I probably would have written my master's thesis on his work. I'm so grateful that the last time we visited Jim, I was able to tell him that he is a genius writer. What do I mean by genius? Jim was able to write from multiple perspectives and characters' points of view with great empathy. Jim seamlessly wove a wide variety of discourses through his books. Physics, sailing, psychology, religion, philosophy, gardening, gambling, politics, astronomy, technology, the California dream. I could go on and on. One can read Jim's books through any one of these lenses or several at once. He layered meaning so that one word or one sentence can be read several ways, each carrying another layer, building a rich tapestry. He used structure to reflect his content and vice versa, as he does strikingly well in Dark Companion. He was such a genius writer, in great part because he was such a close, careful, and loving reader of books and people. The structure of Dark Companion is brilliant. A twist at the end makes the reader rethink, relive, replay the entire novel, thus moving in time, forcing the reader to experience the novel all at once, simultaneously. This is a major theme of the novel. The book is a noir story, and it is a meditation on the Dark Companion. The Dark Companion that is time, the unknown consequences of our decisions, chance, the night sky, a supernova, and death. All of these are the Dark Companion at once. I'm going Reading Jim's books, one can travel in time. One can be with Jim again and again and again. I'm going to read 2 very short passages. Very short. I hope I'm not going over time. These passages demonstrate what I've just explained as the theme of the book. This is the protagonist reflecting on the night sky. The line of thought led to another of his fascinations with celestial objects, that as one observes a supernova, for example, not to mention gleams in the night sky, one is observing an event that actually happened a long, long, long time ago, some 6,500 years in the case of the Crab Nebula. This idea had fomented in young Banerjee's mind the poetic notion that in standing beneath a night sky, an observer is in fact witnessing a kind of chronological simultaneity, a snapshot of events separated by hundreds, thousands, perhaps billions of years, that one can experience a similar effect in observing ambient geology or butterflies in various stages of development, or blooms and bulbs and shoots, and the compost pile in one's garden didn't seem to Banerjee to add up to quite the same dramatic effect. One's garden might represent 10 years of work, or by the species of its various denizens, eons of survival and evolution. The structure of a tree fern, for example, precedes the Ice Age. Much of the night sky is much older than anything you can find on Earth, but it's right now, too. So it had always been possible for Banerjee to convince himself, for an idle hour anyway, that he was witnessing it all happening at once, without time. I have just one more short section. So Banerjee has gone to Vegas. He's playing Russian roulette. Some of you are laughing, you know. He's placed hundreds of thousands of dollars on 00. And he's won. And he's decided he's going to leave it there for another round. He had the feeling that if he dared look around, he might discover that all motion except that ball had ceased. But he didn't look around, not yet anyway. But he needn't have worried every eye in the casino, even those that couldn't see it, even those which had business to attend. Every eye followed the ball in its course. Every eye, that is except Banerjee's, which had begun to perceive other things. The ball had yet to fall. Momentarily, Banerjee couldn't even hear its careen. It was as if a tremendous pressure had popped his ears and left him deaf. And then the ball skipped a numbered cell. The crowd gasped, as if it had collectively forgotten to breathe. The ball tripped over the mouths of the numbered voids. I love that line. Everybody watched. Now, of the entire crowd, only Jasper did not take his eyes off Banerjee, and Banerjee returned the stare. In the old man's eyes, Banerjee detected a vastness of desert, of geology, of mountains, of sunlight, of spangled starry nights and frozen dawns, and a composure derived of a lifetime past inhabiting them. Banerjee felt as if only Jasper, keenly observing, could really see him. The old man across the table moved his lips, but Banerjee couldn't hear him. What could the old man possibly have said? The ball had found its number.
Thank you, Julie. Julie's a really fantastic editor and was a neighbor of Jim and Carol over in Hayes Valley and still live there in Hayes Valley. So I'd like to go back, let's go back in time a little bit. And I'd like to introduce you to Jack Nisbet. Probably most well known for his biography of Mr. Douglas, of the Douglas fir and the Douglas iris, and a lot of books on that part of the world. So Jack, would you like to come up and you have something from Jim?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Patrick. It's Jim would love this crowd, and he would love this venue, for sure. And I want to go the very opposite end of his world, which was, I think the year is 1973, so 50 years ago. He had had no encouragement in writing whatsoever, though he'd been trying for already 10 or 15 years. I mean, he worked. And I was in the construction business. We were building a house in Big Sur. Jim was already good at framing, so we got him to come out and help us. It was a winter very much like this one. Somebody gave us an Opel car, and we decided to take a couple weeks off. And Jim went to Mexico by himself in this Opel car and was about 200 miles south of the border at night, and he hit a cow. And he's on the side of the road with the cow. There's an embankment down to a road, and trying to figure out what to do. The car's wrecked. And the local people who live around there start to drift up to the accident site. And down on the road below him, he sees a flatbed truck with a single taillight. Jim was fixated on all these same things that you all know about since he was a little boy. So he's watching this truck. There was a pause and a distant grinding of gears. Then the truck began to come toward us, tail light first, backing along the dirt road below the highway. I gradually recognized the sound of the motor as one unique to the world of motors, very familiar to me, and guessed it to be the distinctive bubbling made by a flathead Ford V8, as distinctive in its way as the tone of the guitar might have been to an ear much more trained than mine. And sure enough, when the truck had stopped directly below the cow, I could see that it was a 1949 or 1950 flatbed Ford, whose motor could be none other than the venerable Flathead. For 30 or 40 years in the United States, no farm was complete without one. Two men dropped off the truck bed into the road. The music stopped. The men surrounding me stood up. Now what? And Jim had given his guitar, which was one of the few things he had in the back of the Opel, to a kid who had come up, and the kid had been plucking at it. And now the young guitar player handed me my guitar and joined three men who grasped the legs of the dead cow, and with the help of three more pushing on the uphill side and much grunting palaver, then slid the carcass down the slope to the dirt road below. Amid very little chatter, the truck was backed up a little further until the dead cow lay directly beneath the back edge of the truck. I descended the slope to replace the guitar in the case, left it on the trunk of the Opel, and joined the rest of the men. It was apparent they intended to lift the cow onto the back of the truck, but I wasn't sure they could manage it. The cow must have weighed 1,000 pounds, and the edge of the flatbed was slightly below shoulder height to the tallest man there. That was me by 4 or 5 inches. If 8 men could get under her, I calculated 125 pounds per man. But they had been waiting for me. Each man bent to some quadrant of the cow's mass, and I hastily joined them. As my nostrils were suffused with the reek of manure lifting off the hide, the tail in my right fist and my left hand pressing against some corner of its warm flank, the huge corpse began to rise off the ground. Without my realizing it, they had stationed me by the edge of the truck bed on the back side of the cow, presumably on the theory that the tallest man could start the animal over the edge. Incredibly, the beast levitated up to and then over our shoulders. Then, as if by magic, the bulk flowed over our hands and beyond the edge of the truck bed onto the sea of hands that awaited it there. In the end, only the poor creature's head failed to come to rest on the steel of the truck bed. It lolled over the edge with its tongue out, an elastic string of bloodied saliva lurid in the red taillight, stretching from its nostrils to the broken grain stalks that sprouted up out of the untrampled center of the dirt road. "Gracias, amigo," one of the older men said and clapped me on the back. A few men had climbed into the back of the truck, and now as they and others on the ground watched me expectantly. "Is this vaca yours?" I asked them, looking from one to the other. "I'm very sorry that—" "No," said the man, smiling. "He is yours." "Mine?" I asked, astonished. "Of course," he said. "We rob her from you." I was speechless. I had never owned a cow before. "No, truth," I said. "Of who is she?" The man shrugged. "Quien sabe?" I looked at them. They looked at me. "Then she is of ours," I said. "Everybody's, the cow of all the world." Everybody smiled. "Good," said the older man. "You come with us too." "Me?" I said weakly. "Where?" "Home, of course." "Home?" "Si," he said, laughing. "Home." "Seguro?" "Seguro." I hesitated 1 second. Come with them and the cow tonight? Right now? By the light of the red taillight, I looked at the guy in the eye. He was a little older than the rest of the men, about 20 years older than I. White hair and a weathered face, but thin and wiry. He had a definite twinkle in his eye. Something was amusing him. "How are you called?" I asked him. "Jacinto," he said. I held out my hand. "Jaimito," I said. He shook it. "Buenas noches," I said. "Cómo está?" "Bien, gracias," Jacinto said. "And yourself?" "Okay, I guess." I looked at him and hesitated. "A good thing," the old man said. He turned to the others and told them my name. "He comes with us," and everybody agreed how good a thing that would be. I handed my pack up to the man in the guitar, and the guitar to the player Dario, for that was his name, who was also in the truck. "Jaimito," I said. We shook. "Serenade the cow, Dario." Dario grinned and placed the guitar case flat on the carcass of the cow so he could open the snaps. The men and boys in the truck laughed and slapped Dario on the back, saying, "Come up with us, Jaimito." "Thanks, I think I'll walk," I said, noticing that several others, including the old man, who they called Tio Jacinto, were walking too. "All day I go in the car," I said. "The night is beautiful. I will walk." The truck started off slowly. Dario sat on the dead cow, plucking tentative notes out of his guitar. My rucksack and guitar case were stacked between the cow and the sideboards, and 3 small barefooted boys sat on the roof of the cab, facing backwards. It was a pretty good-sized load for the old truck, but the flathead didn't even complain as it pulled the whole scene along in first gear like a hayride, a little macabre, a little nostalgic, gradually disappearing ahead of us in the darkness. At the gap in the fence from which it had emerged, the truck turned off the dirt road and ground its way slowly into the woods until it disappeared. I walked along with Tio Jacinto, a teenager called Juan Pablo, and several others in silence, listening to the crickets and tree frogs of the Mexican night.
Fabulous. I'd like to introduce now Mr. Peter Maravallis, who's very many times from City Lights hosted Jim and some fabulous readings up there. And hello.
Wow, you know, it's amazing to see so many familiar faces after many, many moons. And the fact that Jim could bring us together in this way is really very deeply moving to me. I first met Jim at the Actualist Convention. I don't know how many of you remember that, back in the early 80s, where we had a very brief interaction, but one that actually stayed with me until later. I met him again at City Lights, and We had some wonderful conversations, whether we would talk about literature or art or music or whatever. It was always enlightening to me. I'd always walk away with some kind of insight. Jim was also very, very generous in helping me work through a lot of very ambitious projects. He was so deeply steeped in the avant-garde and things like Dada and Surrealism, and just the literary canon to him was just like, you know, the great vastness of joy that he just loved to, you know, plumb so deep. And he never wrote the same novel twice, and this is to me very significant because a lot of authors are one-trick ponies, and not Jim. This is something that over the years has really impressed itself on me. I'm going to read from Windward Passage, which has some themes, like there's a nautical theme. As many of you know, Jim loved boats and the sea. It is very noirish, but at the same time also, you know, Jim could just break off into these wonderful tangents. This is a letter that the protagonist, the narrator, is writing from beyond the grave. He's just been recently decapitated. He's writing to his sister. And I found this to be a little spooky in a very good way, and it felt somewhat appropriate. My dearest sister, well, I finally wrote one. And what's it turn out to be? A mystery. Pretty funny. Of course, a novel's not a mystery unless it gets solved. Or is it? Come on, let's tell the truth. Mystery novels mostly get solved, big mysteries occasionally get solved, and some mysteries never get solved, right? Take relativity, for example. Relativity got solved, although in fact, there's a case to be made that relativity is an excellent example of a solution in search of a mystery. A riddle that got solved before anybody knew it was a riddle, a solved mystery that posed and continues to pose way more questions than it purported to answer. But we mere mortals don't have to quibble over such things. Like guys like Schopenhauer, and I don't know why that asshole's name just popped into my head, pose impossible solutions to unanswerable questions. Altogether, one prefers Einsteinian-type mysteries. With Einstein, at least you can pitch in and figure out some stuff, like the Schwarzschild radius, for one example. Einstein's solution, the solution that keeps on giving. Schopenhauer's solution to the mystery, to put it simple, and why get complicated, is that it will only spoil your morning coffee to realize that the will to live is the only reality, and that this will, which necessitates constant strife, is insatiable, the only surefire interest-bearing return to which is constant suffering. Well, suffering, sure. Sic passim. There's a Buddhist aspect to this. Buddhists say that suffering is inseparable from existence, but that inward extinction of the self and of worldly desire culminates in a state of spiritual enlightenment beyond both suffering and existence. So there. I'm cribbing from various mildewed tomes here, pages flapping in the winds of my mind despite their and its dampness. But I think that A, extinction of inner self inflicts more suffering than almost anything you can do on earth, short of preemptive warfare. B, preemptive suffering is not really what the Buddha was talking about. And C, I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a Taoist. When life comes, it comes because it is time for it to come. When life goes, this is the natural sequence of events. To accept it with tranquility, to accept all things that happen in the fullness of their time, and to abide in peace with the natural sequence of events, is to be beyond the disturbing reach of either sorrow or joy. This is the state of those whom the ancients called, quote unquote, released from bondage, which I crib from Mr. H.G. Creel's Chinese Thought. Throw in a taste of Chuang Tzu, the predecessor of Lao Tzu, he who bequeathed us, the Tao Te King, and you got philosophy fit to satisfy Horatio, if not Schopenhauer. Up to a point, anyway. Not that Horatio ever had the advantage of either these two guys. One of the beauties of being at the end of history instead of the other end, or even the midstream, is that out here on the pointy tip, we got all these myriad selections to go along with our pointy heads. Call it conspicuous spiritual consumerism. Of course, the problem with this line of thought is a life free of joy and sorrow isn't all that interesting. So I wrote a mystery. And just to make sure he's freed from bondage, the author isn't going to stick around for the denouement. Are you around for it? I am virtually certain that you will be here for the resolution, for there is a mite too many clues along the trail for you. Yes, you, not to suss, which reminds me once again to dispose of the previous 276 pages of this manuscript. Do you note that this is page 279 and that the previous two pages are numbered 277 and 278? That's huge, no? Huge for me anyway. It started out as a novel but wound up compromising numerous scenarios or playlists. That's a good one. Enough of this rum and I'll really be speed writing with a lisp. The playlists, the thing. The Tempest is one book I have not managed to hang on to, but this story, my story, is not so mellow and mature and optimistic. Where was I? The resolution, the finale. Finale implies music. The denouement, better. Yes, he said, stroking the heap of papers like it was an old dog. This is the novel that became its own denouement, while significantly ceasing to be a novel. Actually, it never cohered as a novel, but it was interesting to write my way through what I had hoped to see repeated as human behavior. As Chuang Tzu queried, who is it that has the leisure to devote himself with such abandoned glee to making these things happen? Me, that's who, Charlie. You hear about people burning plays in the kitchen sink, and I myself fed an entire draft of this novel into a wood stove. So I'm here to tell you, one way or the other, it doesn't work. The urge doesn't go away. Kafka, on his deathbed, asked Max Brod to burn his collected works. Max said, sure. Kafka died, and Max didn't do it. They were best friends. So do we know Kafka not only because he failed to make his work go away, but also because he was betrayed? Okay, Kafka is an exception, but literature is the story of exceptions. And how does that square with the snuffing of self? Was it not Philip Whalen himself, a bona fide Zen Roshi, who said, insist there be a voice, then listen? Okay, take the next step. Ask yourself, would you listen to a voice uninformed by suffering?
Such amazing Nisbet. I want to introduce Mian. There she is. I know. Oh, we're going to clap? Yay! I was just by Sweetie's the other day, and I was driving the car, and I was like, I have to go in there, but I had a place to go, and I wanted a cocktail so badly. But anyway, you can explain your connection to Jim. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I cannot remember the time specifically that I met Jim. I feel like he's been in my life forever. So I will just stick with that. My mom is Flicka McGurran, and she's the owner of Sweetie's and Pier 23 Cafe. And 3 years ago, I asked Jim for a story of friendship, something that he would write to explain his relationship with my mom. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. When my friend and translator Freddie Michalski came from Paris to San Francisco for a visit in 1999, I think it was, Flicka and I were determined to show him a good time, and we did. Freddie stayed for 2 weeks, including Christmas and New Year's. As I was then still living in a studio apartment above my cabinet shop on Fillmore Street, I put Freddie up in the wreck of a building I'd bought in Hayes Valley, 6 blocks away, where there was electricity and, there was electricity and one inhabitable room with a couch for sleeping on the second floor, overlooking everything that could go on in a back alley in San Francisco. Freddie and I went to a party every night, and some nights we went to 2 or 3 of them. Never having visited the United States before or since, Freddie got to thinking all this partying was normal behavior. Joe Ellis and friends were still on their 2.5-year run of Monday nights at Pier 23, so for 2 and maybe even 3 successive Mondays, we caught the show. Mike Driscoll put a 5th of Jameson and 2 glasses on the bar. Freddie and Flicka hit it off. There were 2 or 3 sets of excellent jazz. Freddie met Joe and the band and 20 or 30 other people, and very quickly we had a whole new set of friends. Other things came up, among them, via the U.S. Post Office, an invitation to the annual San Francisco cotillion at the Palace Hotel. In the most old-fashioned sense of the term, so antiquated, in fact, that definition seems to have been dropped from the dictionary, unless you count an ordeal, a friend's daughter was coming out. I showed Freddie the invitation. Said Freddie, squinting through the smoke of his cigarette. Sounds interesting. I disagreed. But then it turned out that Flicka had an invitation too. Hey, she said, we'll make an evening of it. George can drive us. My treat. At the time, George Malone had a white mid-60s Lincoln Continental Parade limousine, so called because the roof over the back seat was convertible, while the roof over the front seat remained in place. He took really good care of the car and would drive anybody anywhere. In those days, we called in George and his Lincoln every chance we got. On the night in question, we met at Pier 23, knocked back a shot, piled into George's limo, and were summarily delivered to the carriage entrance of the Palace Hotel. Guys in livery blowing whistles opened both doors. There were fancy people everywhere, flash bulbs, at least one TV crew, etc. At the entrance of the grand ballroom, however, our progress was stayed by a rather stern woman who wore a monstrous corsage on the hip of a floor-sweeping embroidered satin dress, and she clutched a clipboard to her décolletage. Looking Freddie and me up and down, both of us being in denim with leather jackets, she asked to see our invitations. All is in order, I see, pronounced this individual, peering at the embossed cardboard over a pair of half-rimmed spectacles, except she tapped a lacquered fingernail to the lower right-hand corner of the invitation. Only formal wear is acceptable at the San Francisco cotillion. Tuxedos? Oh, said I, thinking perhaps too quickly. My Parisian friend and I are just arriving from the film festival. At Telluride? We're coming, I assured her, straight from the airport. No time to change, I added hopefully. The gardienne drew herself up to her full height. Sir, she pronounced, the cotillion has been a San Francisco institution for 75 years. Its policy has always been, and will always be, formal wear only. I must refuse you entrance. She handed back the invitation. Next, please. We had, of course, foreseen this possibility, and speaking for myself, I was all too willing to give up on this particular event and move on to the next thing. But not Flicka McGurran. Wait for me in the bar, she says. But why the bar? Okay, I acquiesced. Hey, Freddie. I took my friend's arm and steered him down the hall. Have you ever heard of Maxfield Parrish? As a matter of fact, Freddie, who also painted, not to mention that he was a man of culture, had indeed heard of Parrish and was thrilled to find himself having a drink in front of the famous Pied Piper of Hamelin. We were just tucking in to our second round when Flicka reappeared bearing the top halves of two formal outfits: jackets, shirts, ties, freshly pressed, and just the right size. She'd gotten them from the concierge. I didn't ask how, and I still don't know. We changed in the bar bathroom and sneaked into the ballroom via the hotel's kitchen. Freddie never forgot it, nor did I.
This is from this fantastic novel called Old and Cold, which is ostensibly about a homeless hitman. And at one point, he goes to a bar. So you're in the bar with your $5,000. It's a bar you know intermittently well. The intermittence in direct relation to how the work goes. They make their martinis very cold in there. And this is how they do it. The ice, the glass, the cocktail shaker, and the bottle of gin and or vodka. We're not going to get into a pissing match about what constitutes a real martini, are we? They're kept in a freezer. Everything else, olives, vermouth, even the toothpicks are kept in a refrigerator. First, the shaker is removed from the freezer. It's better that the top of the shaker and its vessel are separated, as they are rinsed with cold water while in transit from dishwasher to freezer. Otherwise, the unit will have to thaw a bit after freezing before they are able to be separated and thus, by the delay, accrue deleterious calories. As a concession to intimacy as opposed to alcoholism, no more than 2 martinis are conceived simultaneously. Vermouth is dispensed from a spritzer of the kind you'd mist your pitcher plants with. Sarracenia, Nepenthes, or Darlingtonia, they're all cool. And 1 or 2 spritzes so as to mist the wall of the cocktail shaker opposite the user. And no more are quite sufficient, particularly if you're drinking high-end vodka or gin, which products declaim otherwise definite opinions vis-a-vis the net flavor of their constituent herbals. In fact, if you're spending more than $100 on your fifth of vodka, and particularly your gin, you might want to dispense altogether with your vermouth. In the event, however, only dry vermouth will do, never a sweet one. It's important to remember the origin of the martini, which derives from the American era of Prohibition, 1919 to 1913, can you believe it? Whence arose the necessity of masking the flavor of bathtub gin. Hence, in researching the recipes of the era at the San Francisco Public Library, one will discover the startling admonition to mix one's martini in the ratio of 2 parts gin and 1 part vermouth, an admonition unthinkable nearly 100 years later, in an era of, in fact, the $100 bottle of gin, whose flavor some chemist has devoted a career of experimentation and taste, which holds true for all but the lowest rotgut, a compound of which we have learnt to live, a product available from your corner ghetto grocery. And a piece of advice from the smart money: you can turn rotgut vodka into entirely acceptable cocktail material with an inexpensive home-built charcoal filtration system. Be that as it may, do not let such stray thoughts deviate you from building the perfect martini. Spritzed with dry, chilled vermouth, as I was saying, the far wall of the frozen canister. Once or twice is enough. Drop in 3 or 4 cubes of ice. Better, 2 scoops of cracked ice. Crushed ice will work if everything is properly chilled and celerity is not sacrificed to a phone call or a text message. Next, enter vodka or gin, sufficient to fill your cocktail glasses, judging which quantity only practice will perfect. Cover and shake vigorously. None of your pussyfied shaking. Shake vigorously. If the shaker is stainless steel, do not use an aluminum cocktail shaker or a plated one, as the constituent metals may aggravate the infantilization already brought on by excessive alcohol consumption. And the ingredients have been properly conditioned. The shaker may well numb your hand. Your hand may even become frozen to it. Be tough. Separate your hand from the metal, which should frost nicely like a windshield in Chicago in January. Let stand. Meanwhile, remove olives and toothpicks from the refrigerator. Spear 2 of the former with 1 of the latter. Remove 1 frozen martini glass from the freezer and drop the garnish into it. Immediately take up the shaker and vigorously shake as before. The touch of the frosted stainless steel to the fingers and palm of your hand should now be painful. Persevere. Experience will teach you how long to prolong this second shake. Now pour, shaking the cocktail shaker as you do. This should result in shards of ice garnishing the volume as well as the surface of the cocktail, to the extent that just rattling the last of the driblets out of the shaker, the volume of the martini is shot through with filaments as in some polar febrile dream, and its surface should have the skin of slush atop it. Taste. And expostulation should be readily available. And there I was, between that first sip, when the conic beaker is too full to move or to touch, other than with invacuumating lips. In my first expostulation, when a guy sits down next to me and says, "Did you hear the one about George Bush getting evicted from the White House?" I didn't answer the guy. George Bush has been out of office for what, a year or 5 years? 10? I lost track. I skimmed the second blast off the top of the gelid martini, maybe 2 molecules deep, half vodka and half ice crystals. They only make such martinis in 1 bar in all of San Francisco. Thank you. And I hope you all had the benefit of a Jim Nisbet martini. And did I say A? Anyway. Next, you're probably aware many people were getting fantastic plague ditties during the plague. The plague's not over. Dominic Stansbury is here tonight, and he is going to come up and read to us a plague ditty and maybe talk about that a little bit. Dominic.
Thanks. A little shorter than you. I'm guessing from the response that many of you are familiar with the plague ditties and had the opportunity to read them. And I read them too as they were coming out, and also had a chance to read through them again recently, and also to look closely at the depth and the references, and also Jim's has this both as a crime novelist and as a poet, this ability to pay attention to the quotidian, to the everyday, and to create just a scene that's very real and empathetic with people, and at the same time it has this other sort of intellectual level, and that gives the work a real depth, I think, and it's very unusual, especially in crime fiction. This is poem number 41 from the ditties, And it has a reference about 3/4 of the way through to several characters from a scene in Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, which I only bring up because I had to look it up. And so, every time I peel garlic, I think of Arthur Akamura, who hated to peel garlic. Kitty and I would stand aside as Arthur attacked a clove, disporting, dare I say, the ineluctable scowl of an annoyed warrior, a demeanor entirely belied by the serenity of his art. Once, sous chefferie dispensed, Arthur took me to the studio to show me his latest painting, big as a door, of rain pelting down through the segmented shafts of a dark bamboo grove. He pointed. "How'd I do that?" I shook my head. "Come on, Jim, you're a carpenter." By the hint, unbeguiled, I shrugged. Then Arthur showed me his chalk box. Of course, each drop plummeted a neat line angled from top to bottom of the frame. Snap, and voila, voila, rain. I snip each end of the clove, then crush it with a cheap cleaver purchased on Grant Avenue in Chinatown. At the dawn of culinary expertise, roll off the paper, dice the clove, and I think, too, of the guy who owned the Villa Hermosa at Haste, across Telegraph from Cody's books, who always sat at a table just inside the front door with apron and knife. Before him, a proper porcelain charger, heaped a foot high with pale whole cloves, gleaming, uncrushed, perfectly picked. Until one day, he sold enough delectable rellenos, tostados, and chicken mole to retire to Jalisco, where he owned 2 more restaurants, and housing sufficient to domicile and employ all of his many children and grandchildren. And who, not I, can forget Jewel and Darl and Tull diving the river for a drowned chalk box after a log-rolling current had swept the family wagon, Miss Ma Bundren's coffin, the mules, and all of Cash's tools off the surging bridge. In the same novel can be found the line, "How often have I lain beneath rain on a strange roof, thinking of home?" I didn't think to bring it up with Arthur that day, but looking at the bamboo in his painting then, one could hear the striking rain bearing down on a tin roof before dawn, and how it meant, "No work today, carpenter." Insofar as I'm aware, that's about it for Chalk Box Lit. Come to supper.
And Meg Valentine. Would you like to? Yes, Meg. Sister-in-law.
I'm just going to launch into this. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I knew Jim, and then I'm going to read something from a while ago. I traded heartbreak and a toaster for a fielder's glove in the middle, and landed in the middle of the Mission Muggers, where I met Jim and Lee. The Muggers were a City League slow-pitch softball team Luther Green put together. Most of the other players were older than I was by a decade or so, and it was a lovely mosh of native San Franciscans, Southerners, film editors, sound recordists, writers, and actors. I was in awe, and probably very obviously wet behind the ears kind of awe. For me, it was the best way to get to know the city, to meet new friends and discover that I had a hidden talent. Some new friends eventually became family. I married Lee, and Jim became a cousin. I was without a car and regularly got rides to Mugger games with Alice, and from games with whoever was headed to a bus line going towards home, or sometimes a ride all the way home. Jim gave me a ride once, but before he started the engine, he wanted to read me the opening of a book he just finished, or was just getting published. What I remember were my shoes, staring at my shoes, wondering if I should get out and walk, wondering, oh God, what must the rest of the book be like? Between the oral voyeurism of the first paragraph and that line, I was, with all my youthful exuberance, mortified. The book, of course, was The Gourmet, and if you haven't, you should, although now it's called The Damned Don't Die. I have enjoyed every one of Jim's books since, most often with a dictionary at hand, and considerably less embarrassment. At a later encounter, Jim gave me a broadside, Médé's 1980. He was very proud of that too, was printed by Poltroon and laid out by his own hand on burnt orangish stock, a few red interrupters to bracket bits. It is beautiful and complex. What strikes me, and what I cannot duplicate here, is how the words flow, the flight of the main character drifting down the page, a violent stuttering juxtaposition midway, and a gentle concluding entreaty. After 40 years of knowing Jim, I no longer wonder that his words could transport to so many places. Médé's 1980. It gives them life, yet claims no possession. Tao Te Ching. 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 89, 144, 377. Liber Abaci. Japanese maple, putting out its genetic ornithopters, utopian green, veined, translucent. Sunny diagonal 2x4, suppurating bittersweet pitch on hand, amber. Military hardware high overhead from time to time to time through the leaves. Remember those silent projectiles? Black rain over Vietnam, Laos, through their leaves, little death holes. Sky blue there too. Iranian thought balloons, martyrs, 6,000 of them crucified along the Appian Way. I don't understand you, Spartacus, says Cassius, ruler of all Peter Ustinov's groping superlatives. They are slaves to you, my omnivorence. Exit the prez, singing, well, as I walk through this world, no, nothing stops the Duke of Oil. The maple layers its leaves according to Lau and Fibonacci and reasons we may never understand. Homeostasis, the equations of flow, green apiculation and gravity air. We should teach our seeds to fall with such sense. Our culture could become these green tears, pointed verse instead of winged fears. Thank you.
And now, Mr. Michael Wolf. Hi, Michael.
Thank you, Pat.
So this is all going very well so far. Actualist conventions, plague ditties. I met Jim first in Bolinas. I always thought of him as a writer of poems because I was introduced to him in a bookstore that I owned in Bolinas. It was called the Purple Heron for reasons, I inherited that. And I had that store for 5 years, day and night. And Jim walked in with Joanne Kiger. I think it might have been 1978, something like that. And I realized within about 20 minutes that Jim had read a lot. And we were surrounded by books. And Proust was his current passion. And I'd read a little Proust, So we talked a little Proust, And that was good. That was very good. And I got from Jim the impression that he wrote poems, and then what do you do with the other 23 hours a day? kind of, a fascination that was insatiable, really, and a vivacity that just begged to express itself. So 43 novels doesn't surprise me, really. I know some of those are translations, but nonetheless, that's quite a number of books. We had a lot of things in common. Trucks we had in common. I still own an 87 GMC with a V8 in it, which Jim referred to as a guzzler. And he chastised me for owning it. But it's a great truck, and I get admired occasionally by people who know what that truck is. In Hollister, which is close to where I live. People really in Hollister, they dig that truck. And cows, we have a lot of cows down there as well. I was going to read one of these plague ditties, but before I do, I would like to say, just as a little insight into Jim's working method, he, of course, I'm sure there were others who received these by email occasionally, and I received the one about, well, not about, but that involves Arthur Okamura. And I knew Arthur quite well because I lived in Bolinas for what seemed like forever while I was there. Evergreen, he lived on Evergreen, and we had quite a lot to do with each other. Arthur did tricks. He was a magician. He was a terrific magician, especially in Smiley's bar. He was very good with the quarters going across his knuckles and things like that. I have my Smiley's bar hat on. They have a good hat out there for $20 if you're ever out that way. Jim spent a lot of time in Smiley's bar. I don't drink. I never drank, but I think the thing about a martini is you just pass the vermouth in front of it. You don't you just pass the light, that's enough, is what I think for the vermouth. Jim and I had classics in common. I crazily studied classics in college, and he loved Latin. He had no Greek. I actually knew Greek, but we would talk about that from time to time. And the working method with Arthur, the poem involving Arthur, was simply this. I wrote to him and I said, if you didn't say every time I cut the garlic, I think of Arthur, it might be more credible because, you're surely once you have, right, So what about many times? Or sometimes? Or how about occasionally? And he wrote me back and he said, too late. I thought that was pretty good. And I'm sure that in some way or other, he came up with that from Joanne, who always felt that first words were the best words, which we had many arguments about. So, this is Plague Ditty number 36. It's about as classical as a poem can get. And it's a dialogue around a fire involving some Roman soldiers who are about to prove their mettle in battle. It seems to me, said Titus Quintius, opening his hands to the fire, that death releases us into this life, then reclaims us willy-nilly, according to the rules of a great game you'll never understand. A knot popped, lofting a spark into the darkness. A few of us indeed, Marcus Acilius replied, as he drew a scrap of stone along the length of his blade, loom as if unleashed onto life itself, while the majority might claim, and not without reason, that it's life itself that's unleashed on the wretched rest of us. Short or tall, fat or thin, knees unstrung by disease or obdurate cataclysm, shave your head and get on with it, or history will shave it for you. Yes, muttered Quintius, his breath visible in the cold. History, the bean counter, the gourmet, the unrelenting custodian of death. Selecting a length of bright blade at random, Acilius shaved an inch of hair off the back of his wrist, puffing the short ends toward the fire with a grunt of approval. He stood up out of his cloak and sheathed the sword, greaves gleaming even by firelight, his scars manifest. Let's go, is the last line. So, thank you very much. You know, this loquacious, vivacious man has brought us together, and I'm so grateful.
All right, Mr. Brian Grossman. Brian.
So I met Jim in 1970 when I went to school at Chapel Hill in North Carolina, and Jim ran a little country store out in a country road out on 15501, and I lived in a little trailer behind that country store. It was called the Farm Store, and you could go into the farm store and you could get yourself a can of beans or a box of grits, or you could buy a pharmaceutical, an over-the-counter pharmaceutical called Black Draft, which, to the best of my knowledge, was a cathartic. It was commonly used around those parts. And that actually became the moniker for a literary journal called the Black Draft Journal that was published from the back room in the farm store. And that was my first experience with a literary journal. You know, when I met Jim, I knew immediately that I'd met someone who was just totally unique. And what I didn't know at the time was that 50 years plus years later, he would still be someone who I would want to spend any free time I had with. You could talk with Jim about just about anything. He knew a little bit about everything and a lot about a lot of stuff too. And anyway, you know, what I really cherished was the way that Jim had this gift of eliciting the stories of people. He had an interest in knowing what made you tick. He wanted to know your story. And I think as a writer that became just the grist for his mill. And I was always amazed at how this person who had such a worldly knowledge and such a grasp of literature could still do the most basic things like build a house, build a cabinet. He just had knowledge of so many different things. So I chose to read something that kind comes from an unpublished work called Skylark, and it's Skylark Stories, Essays, Monologues, and Anecdotes. And from the introduction, he writes, he would also like to express gratitude to any number of other people, but particularly such as may think to find themselves whole or dismembered among their fictional confreres in these pages. Some of these shared unforgettable moments, advertently or otherwise, with the present author, which enabled or permitted him to marvel at their benevolence or courage, ingenuity or foolishness, luck or misfortune at, in other words, their and his own immortality. In other words, their and his own humanity. It's like finding nettles in molten gold, or vice versa. So here's a reading. I never knew Jim without a dog, or without a pickup truck for that matter. But I knew several of his dogs. The first dog I knew was a dog named Sam. It was built like a small Volkswagen van. It was a Rottweiler, as solid as can be, and of course his most recent dog, Dexter Brown, or Dexter Bruin as he referred to him. But yeah, so this is a little something that Jim wrote about one of his dogs, PH. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The westerly had come up and blew a stiff breeze through the cab of the truck as I drove him across town for the last time. He's taken PH to the vet for the last time. The wind picked up the long brown fur along his back and the white and black strands mixed with it at the end of his tail tucked under his nose, and he watched me. The veterinary was crowded with pet owners. A cat had the sniffles, 2 puppies needed their shots, another cat coming out of its anesthetic, another dog getting washed. With one thing or another, we waited 45 minutes. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, his head in my lap. In that position, lying down, there was nothing apparently wrong with him. His eyes were alert, nervous. All any of us ever thinks is, if you're alive, right? What's this sudden intrusion of dysfunction down below that revokes your permanent, even while the mind is still quick? How comes the mechanism of bright sentience to the extinguished? I thought of Pound's line about the seer Tiresias, sought and held by Odysseus, who even dead yet hath his mind entire. It seemed a vague imprecation, a plea wailed aside the one-way threshold between life and death, a cry against total annihilation. Alas, try as I might to understand, and though giving comprehension up to the shrug of another line, occurring further into the same canto, knowledge the shade of a shade, the first line would not leave me. I could hear Pound's phlegmy old voice intoning it as I watched the pet owners come and go. And when I looked into PH's roomy old man's eyes, the line kept recurring like a pesky hook to an annoying popular song, bearing in the end nearly as little meaning. Finally, the doctor took us in. He too had known PH over the years and called him an old friend. He asked if I wanted to be present. I nodded. He called in an assistant. It was I who took the old-timer's head in my arms and stroked his muzzle, telling him everything was fine. It's okay, PH, it's okay. My voice cracked as I lied to him. When the needle entered at the wrist, the vein plumped by his stout heart so that the stuff of his life immediately bloomed red in the syringe, he whimpered and looked up at me. The doctor pressed the plunger slowly, trying himself not to rush the job, not to botch it, but pressed it surely, then plucked the empty point from its work. The dog raised his head out of my hands and breathed deeply once, twice. With a third breath, he shuddered. Then his eyes fixed open, and he relaxed into my arms for the last time. The veterinarian searched for a pulse and folded his stethoscope. He's gone, he said softly. and gently closed PH's eyes. I was weeping. A lot of memories, he added. Yes, I whispered. Stay with him as long as you like, he said, and ushered his assistant outside, closed the door after them. He was still perfectly warm, the fur long, golden brown, flecked with black, the whitened hairs at the chin, the white splash at his shoulders, the white feet, all innocently lifelike. Memories flooded and mingled with the luminosity of the present, and it was quite some time before I realized I was calling and stroking a corpse, that he could no longer feel my hands on the side of his face, behind his ears, along his flank, at his shoulders, his chest, the strokes that I'd learned over the years he'd liked, and yet, except for a few people, he'd never begged for. And so I left him there, lying on his side in a favorite pose, as if asleep in an odd place, not under my desk, not under the kitchen table, not on the roof next to the bedroom window, or on the rug next to the bed, nor on the seat of the pickup parked in the yard with its door open, rather on a stainless steel table in a small office in a converted pharmacy in San Francisco on August 18th, 1984.
Thus ends the reading part of this evening. I want to introduce now to you someone we all know and love, Carol Collier.
Jim and I were perfect for each other. He was mine and I was his, and we knew that about each other and counted on it. We loved each other. But Jim had other loves. People. With his generous spirit and his great curiosity about the world, he welcomed people in his life. Jim didn't care whether you were a famous author or a really good electrician. As long as you were up to something, he was interested in you and your story. He and his brother Jack, a naturalist and author in his own right, were especially close and shared a lively, lifelong intellectual exchange. Stories. He loved stories, was a story gourmet. He gathered them and told them wherever he went, and his storytelling was mesmerizing. When he came to California in 1974, he hitchhiked across the country from North Carolina with his friend Ricardo Baltazar Nunez, his dog PH, and a backpack. On their long trek, which included many waits by the side of the road, they once got a ride with a driver who said he would keep going as long as Jim could keep telling stories. Not surprisingly, that got them across 2 states, big ones. Writing. He started writing when he was 15. In college, he majored in physics, but after a year, he knew he wanted to be a writer. He changed his major, and his direction was set. From then on, he built his life so he could keep writing no matter what. He wrote 15 novels, 6 books of poetry, and many stories and essays, plus his nonfiction work, laminating the conic frustum. And there's an example of a conic frustum back here on the table. Books and reading. On that hitchhiking trip west, among the necessities in Jim's backpack were 2 books, James Joyce's Ulysses and Philip Whalen's On Bear's Head. He had just left behind the country store he'd been running in rural Chatham County, North Carolina, where they sold gas, beer, provisions like Vienna sausage and pickled eggs, and a selection of books published by City Lights. He read voraciously poetry, the great novels, Faulkner, Conrad, Melville, the Russians, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Russian history, memoir, Postovsky, Akhmatova. He was fascinated by the chronology of Chekhov's writing, how his skill and depth grew with time and practice. In the last few years of his life, he reread all of Proust's Remembrance of Things Past for the third time in his life, collected everything he could find by the authors of ancient Greece and the Roman Empire, and read it all in succession, from Thucydides to Suetonius. He bought books. When he heard about a book that sounded interesting, he'd call his local bookseller and order it. When he bought a book, he read it. If he liked it, he kept it in his library. If he didn't, it went in the sale box. His library contained 1,000 volumes and more, and not a single New York Times bestseller. He didn't read them, and he didn't write them. When he started publishing in France, his friends there were pleased to find him well-read on French history and culture. He loved Stendhal, Proust, Verlaine, Baudelaire. He read them all and took great pleasure in discussing them. He wrote his own translation of the poems of Baudelaire. He read adventure, science fiction, memoir, biography, natural history, physics, cosmology, and 3 newspapers every day. In his writing, he played freely and exuberantly with all he learned from his avid reading. Music, mostly jazz, though he liked Lady Gaga and Lil Nas and Taylor Swift, he was not predictable. He taught himself to play guitar and had a stack of books on music theory, fake books, real books, and sheet music, as well as sheaves of chord diagrams he'd notated himself. He was not satisfied to learn a simple popular song and strum along. He started with the tunes he liked: Skylark, Nature Boy, Spring Can Really Hang You Up the Most, the Gymnopedes by Satie. He was fascinated by the way the chords related, interlocked, and built on each other. After he closed the cabinet shop he ran for 30 years, sold our house in San Francisco, and moved to Sausalito, his daily routine included driving the pickup down to Horseshoe Cove overlooking Golden Gate Bridge with his guitar, sheet music, and notebooks for a couple of hours of practice with the dog Dexter Brown Jr. to keep him company. Sailing. He said if he'd found out about sailing sooner, his whole life would have been different. But for the last 15 years, he sailed the San Francisco Bay. He bought Argo, a classic wooden Herreshoff H-28 sailboat, for $4,000 and a promise to take care of her. She was docked at a well-run and neighborly harbor in Sausalito, where Jim quickly found a solid community of real sailors and some good friends with good stories. He learned sailing skills and learned to do the woodworking required to keep Argo maintained, which included something called spiling a plank. He read a pile of books on sailing. He learned navigation, studied the tides and conditions. He learned to tie all of the basic sailing knots and went on to the more exotic ones. Others might watch TV in the evenings after work. Jim would settle in with a martini or two and a few lengths of line and a book on knots. California. San Francisco may have been the love of his life. Though she changed and they parted ways in the end, when he first came to the city in the 70s, he found his paradise. San Francisco gave him his place to flourish. Most of his novels were about San Francisco and the fabulous stories he found there, observed with palpable detail and always humor, sometimes quite dark. In California and the West, he found the landscape that made him feel most alive. Its redwood forests, rocky coastline, and high desert, an exhilarating escape from the oppressive East with its moody, deciduous trees and seasonal colors that evoked such humid melancholy. He'd take off camping for a week, exploring the Sierras and high desert, skiing at off-the-beaten-track lodges, back when such a thing existed, taking the unpaved back roads. He explored the coast, walking up the beach with a knapsack from the Golden Gate to Bolinas, where he soon met Joanne Kiger and Bobby Louise Hawkins, and was immediately enveloped in the world of Bolinas poets, artists, and other creative explorers. Joanne loved his early detective novel, The Gourmet. "Ooh, I've always wanted to meet someone who writes that kind of book," she said. Gary Snyder had famously admonished her to stop reading so much trash. But Joanne and Jim were far beyond those labels in their work. It just amused them to play around with them. Dogs. First, there was PH, who was abandoned as a puppy at the farm store in 1974 and traveled cross-country with Jim to become a San Francisco dog, who would take himself for walks in Alamo Square Park back in the Wild West days of 70s San Francisco. The door to the old apartment building was often standing open. Then came Riley and Bert, my dogs. When Jim and I first took up, they became San Francisco dogs when Jim and I married, and they took to Jim right away as a kindred spirit. And then Dexter Brown Jr. He came from a shelter in Modesto as a puppy and turned out to be the most strangely intelligent dog of all. He kept us on track. He'd go to the cabinet shop with Jim and sleep on a blanket under the desk. After Jim retired, Dexter was with him constantly. When they were driving down the road in Dexter's truck, Dexter would rest his head on Jim's shoulder and put a paw on his thigh. More loves. Add furniture design, cabinet making, hard work, physics, mathematics, and cocktails. Jim was renowned for his martinis and Negronis. Do not include a desire for more money than he needed to be comfortable and keep writing. Any kind of clothing that wasn't jeans or their close kin. New cars. He bought a 2-year-old GMC Sierra pickup truck in 2005 and kept its machinery well maintained, ignoring the inevitable fender scrapes and dents of city life. He still had it in 2022. Television, didn't own one. Popular novels, not interested. Popular movies, nope. Academia, keep at arm's length. Facebook and social media, forget it. Of course, he knew how computers worked, and though he insisted on using his old DOS computer because he preferred to write out the code. He lived his life fully, out to the edges, with goodwill, good cheer, and generosity. He was brilliant, and he used his brilliance to enjoy life and to appreciate this spectacular world around us. He was utterly unique, special. We were lucky to have him.
And now we'd like to just, if people would like to take turns coming up, and Lee, the cousin Lee, step up. I know you got it. And so just feel free. And then we'll, we want to thank Bruce Foreman again for his fabulous music tonight. And he'll come back and regale us, and we can have a little more wine and a little more food too. So be sure.
Thank you, Patrick. No, I'm not sure. Lisa, I'll do my best, folks. It's good to see so many old friends here, and especially some work friends that we did jobs for. Yeah, just yell out if you have directions for me. Downward? Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'll talk to you later. There it goes. So I'm Jim's first cousin. He was my oldest cousin. And I was, I think, 13 on the list, 14 downward from him. We were all boys, The only first girl was my cousin Mary. And then her sister came after me and Heath. And then my sister came 10 years after me. But the first time I was really aware of Jim and how cool he was when he showed up one Thanksgiving. We always had Thanksgiving at Uncle Jim's house, his dad. And they lived in Union County across the state line from us in North Carolina. And they were sophisticated people. And I loved going there because nothing was like my house, you know. Everything was new and modern, and it was beautiful. And Jim showed up one Thanksgiving. He had long hair, just mid-60s. He had long hair and driving a Mustang, and not just a Mustang, a Shelby Cobra Mustang. And even at my young age, but I was in the South, I knew that was a big deal, you know. That's the kind of person, you know, you kind of want to get to know and hang out with, and, you know, pretty cool. And I'm going to jump to the mid-70s now, and I decided, Jim had been living in San Francisco, and I said, well, I could go visit Jim, and had enough money to go to school for a year and hang out and see what it's like. And I did it. Best decision I probably ever made in my life. And I better start looking at this. So the first job I did for Jim, though, was not construction. He called me up one day and said, hey, Lee, what are you doing next weekend? I said, I'm not doing anything. And which I went to art school, by the way, so I didn't do very much of anything ever when first year I lived here. And he said, well, I've been recording poetry readings for KPFA, and I'm going to go to this actualist convention. You want to help me lug my equipment and set up? And I said, sure. And I asked him what an actualist is, and he said, I don't know. So we get over there to Berkeley, and it's at a warehouse that some artists Jim's age have taken over, and David Shine, who I got to know later, he was a dancer. They were painters. They were writers. They're all kind of people that, mostly older than me. I'm Jim's country cousin. I was fish out of water, I tell you. But man, that was something. You know. And we had David Shine had given us a little room to put the recorder. We set up the mic out in his dance studio. And Jim showed me how to work the tape recorder, and you know, and I would come, one of us would sit in the room, and mostly Jim, but I would come and relieve him so he could go out and do stuff. And as the weekend went on, that room became like the place where people came and hung out. You know? And I would sit there and watch Jim talk a language I did not know. I read books. I've read, you know, Kurt Vonnegut, you know. And I knew who Allen Ginsberg was. I read the little Kerouac. I liked Beats, you know. Yeah, those are cool people. But, you know, I'm not an intellectual. So it was an amazing thing to watch. I'm going to jump forward 2 years later. Jim called me up and said, hey, Lee, what are you doing? No, Daddy wants me to come frame a house for him. You want to come with me and work for me? And I was out of school by then. I went, hell yeah, man, why not? Yeah. And the rest, as they say, is history. I never looked back. I had a great ride with Jim. It was unbelievable. I met all kind of people. I watched Jim interact with people. And it was beyond amazing. But we went from framing and remodeling from a pickup truck to a cabinet shop, at first on Divisadero Street, and then we moved to West Oakland. And Jim did not like West Oakland, not because he had anything against West Oakland, but it was across the bridge from San Francisco. And as you know, Jim loves San Francisco. So he found a place in Lower Haight with an apartment right next door, and he was in love. He loved Lower Haight, and Lower Haight loved him. And people, as they did with Jim, they started coming by, and they were the usual suspects of, Bodho and August and Erno and Barry. And my personal favorite was Joe Ellis, who's been mentioned here, of course, who Clutch called the new Vinny. And there were the occasional visitors from LA and New York and Europe, and a lot of you here would come by. And it's, man, seeing some old faces, it blows me away. When we weren't busy working, this has all been said before, Jim was busy doing what he loved, being a poet and a writer. And he wrote noir novels with the blackest of humor. Maybe too black? No, not in my opinion. Fuck the Chronicle. Thank you. Yeah. Fuck, I'm good. Jim's novel belied the light and wonderment of his imagination. It was a privilege to ride shotgun beside my cousin Jimmy and watch him interchange with people from the famous to the homeless. He treated both with equal respect and curiosity. Most of all, Jim loved life. He loved Carol and he loved his friends. He wanted to hear their stories as much as he wanted to tell his. The good stories I would hear the next day. And as writers do, Jim would spin a tale and turn a breeze into a whirlwind, like a butterfly changing the climate. Jim, you drove splendidly a long stretch. I'm locking the shop doors and I'm putting on the chain nice and tight, the way you taught me. I'm leaving a light on so it'll greet you when you return from distances unknown on earth. Thank you. Anybody want to say something? Feel free.
I'll just read a few quotes that haven't been said yet. He said without any kind of irony, I didn't get where I am in life by trusting people. I think, and that's from Snitch World. As serious as Mahler's Ninth. All right, also from Snitch World. Donald Crowhurst's Teaganmouth Electron. I don't know what that is. Cafe Flesh at the Roxy. Sitting in the catbird seat. Fuchsia polyvinyl chloride lederhosen with appropriate zippers. Yeah, pineapple shirts. Chartreuse phlogiston. Haunted Heart by Joe Stafford. Only in San Francisco do meet the happy conjunction of Puccini and homelessness. Kind of like the little thrills folks get with their kiddies at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, looking at Edward Teach or Jack the Ripper or Gilles de Rais or Andrew Lloyd Webber. And finally, Riparian Sam.
Hi, folks. My name's Miles. I was one of the people that used to work at the shop. Clutch, my main man, is over there. I replaced him when he moved on to other things. Just a quickie, but I drank a fair amount of Jim's martinis. He drank some of mine. We'd argue about which one was better. That's one thing we used to do at the shop. But the perils of martini drinking. Jim went out one night. I think it was a Tuesday. We had worked together. I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I come in, he's got a black eye. I thought, oh, Christ, you didn't go to one of those bars you used to wax about, did you? And meet a fate. And he goes, nope, Dostoevsky did this. He'd fallen asleep with a tome, after a few martinis with me and proceeded to hit himself in the face, and he had a black eye that Dostoevsky gave him. Anyway, that was my friend Jim. Just wanted to say that for you.
Hi, my name's Greg Gannon. I've known Jim for about 40 years. We met on the Kerouac documentary in 1982, and I was fast friends with Jim. We met on the Kerouac documentary. That I don't know if anyone's seen that, but we shot that at the Naropa Institute in 1982. And Jim and I have been fast friends ever since that. We met on that. And I knew I loved Jim when that one of the first nights we were there, and there was an assembly with, because it was the 25th anniversary of the publishing of On the Road. And so all of the living legends of beatdom were there. And we interviewed as many as we could for the film. And Jim was doing the sound. And so he was listening to this gathering, and he was listening to the main mic, but he was also watching as Chungnam Trungpa, who was the head of Naropa, pulled up in his huge stretch limo. And this man was proverbially drunk. I don't know if anyone knew about this fellow, but it was the same man who dumped an ashtray on Gary Schneider's head in a moment of meditation, whatever. And Jim sat there watching from backstage. He was on his equipment, and watched as Chungnam Trumpa's limousine and this group of 8 or 10 minions who were running alongside. It was sort of like the CIA, the Secret Service running along the president's limo, were running along this limo, and he was parking his stretch into a parking spot. And it took Jim, the way he described it was hilarious. He said it took them half an hour to get this drunk Tibetan rolling down the window and yelling at them because they were not in the perfect alignment with the parking lines. And he was yelling at them. And Jim was telling the story after he'd finished this assembly, and he had us in stitches. It was just hilarious. And it's Jim telling this story. I don't tell it well, but Jim, when he told this story, I realized I like this guy, and I loved him ever since. And Jim and I went through the last 40 years of building things, telling stories, and I just loved him. What can I say?
My name is Joe. I met Jim in 84-ish. One day in 1986, I was doing my job. I was selling tools, and I was on a bus going from job site to job site, and I met a young woman, and I invited her out to a party on Friday night, and she said, "Oh, you mean tonight?" That's how smooth I was. And I said, "Yeah, there's going to be a friend of mine there, and we went and actually had lunch, and she told me about her job, and she was working as a typesetter for working on this nascent technology, Kurzweil reader, and there was a book she was having this horrible time with, and she was working the graveyard shift, and this book would just drive her crazy because there was one line that it couldn't translate, and it was just killing her. It was really driving her nuts, and it was keeping her up at night. It was horrifying her, and I didn't really ask much more than that. And then when I told her that my friend Jim Nisbet was going to be at the party, she said, "I fucking hate that guy." I said, "What are you talking about?" They were changing the gourmet to the damn don't die. And the line was, "I've always wanted to skin a woman just to see what was on the inside." And she had to be in that building by herself, haunted building, all night. And she hated him until she met him. And we became even better friends. And she's with me now after all this time. Thank you, Jim.
Mr. Bruce Foreman.
I don't know about all you, but all this talk about Jim Nisbet really makes me thirsty. I wouldn't say the central tenet to our relationship was drinking, although that's what we were doing most of the time we were hanging out. Jim was a nice bunch of guys. I mean, he could be the most generous, the most harsh, the most belligerent, the most loving, the most stupid, the smartest, yes, pontificating, just loving human. And it's wonderful to have a person like that in your life, and we're all lucky that that he shined his light into our orbit. And I'm grateful to know a lot of you here because of him. And when I first met him, you know, we were introduced because I play music and he loves jazz, and then he found out I could write. I wanted to write. I mean, yeah, I can put a sentence together with punctuation and letters and everything. But he was very harsh. I would like to say a lot harsher than I was about his guitar playing. And I would, my biggest regret for today is to not to have him here heckling all of you. But I'm going to play some music and just let it go from there. And you can listen or not. It's okay. I'm putting it out to Jim. Thank you.